pero pueden poner preguntas en español en el chat y al final también podemos tomar algunas preguntas en español y traducirlas. So thank you so much, Annette, for joining us in this colloquium of sociology at Universidad de los Andes. Annette Lareau is a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2024, she's a Leverhulme Professional Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology at London School of Economics. She's the author of the award-winning books Unequal Childhoods, Home Advantage, and Listening to People. With Blair Sackett, she authored We Thought It Would Be Heaven, Refugees in an Unequal America. She's currently doing a study of the blessings and challenges of wealth for families. And Annette Lareau is also past president of the American Sociological Association. We're honored to have you here, Annette. And I also want to thank my colleague, Maria Jose Alvarez, who made the connection with Annette. So thanks again for being here, Annette. The floor is yours. And at the end of your presentation, we'll have time for questions and a discussion with the audience.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming today. Many thanks to Maho and to Angela and other people at the university for inviting me and making me feel welcome. My talk today is about the nuts and bolts of doing qualitative research. Qualitative research is inherently filled with many challenges. Now, that's also true for quantitative research, but qualitative research is a little bit more difficult because people feel a little bit isolated. So here at the next slide, you'll see that I'm, as it turns out, other people are helping me with the slides. So thank you for understanding if there's a hiccup. So in the normal scientific method, which many of us were taught in the university many times, there is a system where you plan a design, you have a hypothesis, you create a research question, you have hypotheses, then you collect the data, then you draw conclusions. And and some people think, oh, you just have to make a few adjustments for qualitative and how you report it. But as I show on the next slide, the qualitative approach is really fundamentally different than what I call the scientific method. So the next slide, which we're ready for, slide 3, shows that really the entire process is more what they say iterative. You take a step, you gather information, you evaluate. You take another step, you gather more information, you evaluate. It is emergent. Now, even though I'm older, I've done a number of research processes. I've been doing a study recently on wealthy families, which I'm happy to tell you about. And I have to say, a lot of the times I just really didn't know what I was doing when I was doing my research project. I was confused and I had to make adjustments. And so as I gained access, I adjusted, I collect data, I adjusted. And then this means sometimes that I ask questions at the end of the data set that certainly about halfway through that I never asked in the beginning. So this creates some challenges, but it's better to emerge, to have it be adjusting so you learn as you go. So as the next slide, this emergent quality creates anxiety because you don't really know what you're doing. There are many roadblocks, but most importantly, you have to act as if you know what you're doing in key moments. People have to write dissertation proposals, they give conferences, with the people you're recruiting, you have to act like what you know what you're doing. And so it's this tension about the emergent nature of it and the anxiety that I talk about in my book, Listening to People, in the next slide. So listening to people is a very deeply practical book. It talks about from the beginning to the end of a study, from daydreaming about what you want to do to writing. And it especially focuses on interviewing, observations, analysis, and writing it up. And so I'm going to give you sort of a taste of some of the themes in the book. And the next slide, please. So I'm a big fan of small studies. Reasonable people disagree, but I prefer deep, rich data. So I like to do interviews that last 2 hours. I would prefer to interview fewer people and go in more depth than more people and less depth. I'm also a fan of people doing observation, so you can see what people do in the day and then writing field notes. And so to me, although there are many interesting projects, I don't personally believe that anything goes. I believe there are high quality data sets and data sets that are more problematic. And high quality data sets are about the depth of the data, deep, rich data, and also focusing your data collection so you answer the question, so what, and try to make a contribution to the field. So next slide, please. So first, I think you should start by daydreaming. Like, what would you like to do? What would you like to study? There were many people for this book, Unequal Childhoods, and many people told me flat out it was impossible to do. Rachel Ellis just finished an excellent book about women in prison. And one of her advisors said, you're never going to be able to get into a prison, because she had to get ethics reviewed by both the prison and the university. But they were wrong, and she did get in. So I wouldn't give up at first, and I would do some real daydreaming. But also I would think about what bothers you about the literature you've read, and what do you think is missing in the field. So then in the next slide, please. But then very soon there is cold, hard reality. There is time, how much time you have. We all have to work for money. So how much time do you have to work on this project? It's better, you want to be at a place that's close by. You often is valuable to have comparison groups. One study cannot do it all. Small is good, and there's a trade-off between participant observation and interviews. I think, especially in a doctoral program, it's excellent to do participant observation, because it's one of the times in your life where you'll have the time to do it. Many people have constraints, but often compared to, say, later in life, it's a more opportune time. And often the best and most famous ethnographies were dissertations. Next slide, please. So you have to make hard choices. Who will you study? Why will you study them? How will you get in? There just are not no easy answers. And then the problem is just when you really don't know what you're doing, and you're really like, I was reading last night something I wrote in 2016. I just finished data collection on my Wealthy Family project, and I was completely discouraged. I thought this is never going to work. And so there's often some amount of self-doubt for some people, for some of us with that. But then you have to act like you know what you're doing when you're gaining access. I think it's invaluable to use social ties. It's very hard to get into schools and prisons and other places, and using social ties, you can ask a friend of a friend, you can ask everybody you know. Do you know somebody who's a principal at this kind of school? And universities are very helpful. Blair Sackett wrote a paper about ghosting, and she found that even writing other universities can be helpful, and people can help you get in. And you need to be a little flexible. Next slide, please. You can easily keep 50 people in your head. And a lot of excellent papers are based on, say, a year of observation and 10 or 20 interviews. But people at Harvard often do these huge studies with 200 or 300 people, but often they don't collect all their data. So I think it's better to collect your own data. But remember, everything compounds. About a quarter of interviews cancel on you. 1 in 4 interviews cancel and have to be rescheduled. You have to transcribe them. You have to code them. The focus is on the meaning of what you've learned and conceptual variation. You're not trying to generalize about a population. You're not trying to say college students do this. You're trying to say, when we've tried to understand the experience of first-generation college students, we've emphasized this, and this. You're looking at conceptual contributions rather than general. So you're looking at, that's your contribution, and small is helpful. Next slide, please. So this was my overly ambitious study for unequal childhoods. And I think the key thing, notice I got asked, I made hard decisions. I wanted racial variation, and so I had white and African-American kids, probably because where I was living, there were a lot of African-American kids in the schools at the time. So I didn't just have 2 or 3 Asian American families or 4 Latino families. I wanted to have a certain number of people in each category. Now, there are times when I've had a more heterogeneous working class category and had middle class and upper middle class, with upper middle class being professional, graduate degree, while middle class maybe, bank tellers, white collar workers of some kind. So it's really up to you what kind of groups you choose and the race and class and gender. Next slide, please. So in unequal childhoods in the observations, I did observations in schools. 9 of and I had 12 families. That was the most unusual feature of the book. I asked 19 to get 12. By the time I asked them, I had interviewed them. I'd written a thank you note. If the father was in the house, I interviewed them, wrote a thank you note. I'd seen them at school events, including conferences. And so I wasn't asking them out of the blue. I was happy with my response rate, given that the observations were usually 20 visits, usually every day for a month. The visits lasted 2 or 3 hours with 1 overnight visit, and I had a multiracial team. I did 3 to 4 visits per week with 2 families, and the other families I just did 1 to 2 visits per week. So, you just have to make hard trade-offs. So I had this extremely painful moment where I had, for unequal childhoods, I'd done 6 months of observation in one school and 6 months of observation in another school. And I was trying to have Black middle-class families and white middle-class families. And I was in a predominantly white school, and over 80% of the students were white. And so there were only 3 or 4 children who were from Black families in each of the 3rd and 4th grade classrooms. And I was able to get all of them to agree for an interview in the middle class school. I could not get them to agree to be observed. This was a setback because by then I had started it and I didn't want to have white middle class families and Black single parent families, because I thought it would harm the book and you would never know, well, maybe it was because they were single parent or not. And there was a mom who I hadn't asked her, but she was a single parent, middle-class mom in the same school, and I was pretty sure she would have agreed. But because I was committed to being systematic on things that I thought might matter, I let go of that and ended up going outside the school and interviewing people who were middle-class Black families who attended other schools. This was a complete disaster because I had spent a year observing in the school. And because I ended up introducing 2 Black middle-class families that weren't in the school, I could no longer focus the study around schools. It became families instead. So this was a setback. But I think you have to make hard choices, and I would make the same choice again. I would probably do it a little differently. But I think it's important to be clear about what matters, where can you be flexible, and where can you not be flexible. Next slide, please. So here's a hypothetical study for certainly for a faculty member, possibly for doctoral students, I don't know. But I want to show you just how quickly everything multiplies. So all of us want to do these beautiful studies with multiple classes, multiple racial groups, maybe have different sexuality, et cetera. But then if you want to, I like to have at least 8 or so people in each category. And I don't want to have 1 or 2, and I don't want to have 20. So, but there's a huge difference between 7 and 11, because if you do 7, you just have 21, you have 42. If you do 11, you're up to 66. And again, this is just everything compounds. So this isn't just another way of saying small is better. Next slide, please. So once you start going, you need an elevator speech. In my first book, Home Advantage, I was a doctoral student. I stupidly wrote a letter to the principal that was basically like a paper and had all this jargon in it. He showed it to a teacher. It was a disaster. And so you really need to have a short, brief speech that you could say in the course of an elevator ride that doesn't use jargon. So to me, this is a speech similar to what I would have said as a doctoral student. Social class is correlated with educational achievement. I want to decode these mechanisms through which these processes unfold. This is not everyday English. This is not something people would say to one another. And so a better approach would be to say, I'm interested in kids in different walks of life, and I'd like to visit your classroom twice a week for 2 hours. You want to be clear. Next slide, please. There's a complex issue, which has many people have written about at great length about positionality and insider and outsider. People who share insider status, who have the same gender or race or class position, often have access and trust. Victor Rios writes eloquently about this in his book, Punished. But they may take for granted key issues and they may miss others and they may not be able to ask certain questions because it would just be inappropriate. Outsiders are often presumed to be ignorant of cultural mores, and so they can ask more freely than others. And Michelle Lamont talks about this in Dignity of Working Men, but they also don't have the same insider knowledge. For better or worse, we have a position where we're either insiders or outsiders. And I think we just have to accept the strengths and weakness of it and go with it. And so I'm sorry, this is the better elevator speech where you focus on what you're asking them to do. Okay. So you want to prepare an elevator speech. You want to tell everybody the same thing. You want to figure out who you are and what you're doing. Like with the families, we had a rule, unless there was blood or unless it was life-threatening, we were not intervening, period. And that meant, sometimes things were a little challenging, but we weren't there to train them. This was not the goal. We were not social workers trying to train them. We were trying to learn what their daily life was. We were correcting them every day about how they should be raising their families. Why bother to be there? Not to mention it's disrespectful. So I think you just want to figure out what you can do and who you are and what you're doing. Are you going to help with classroom grading or not? And you're going to try to figure out who you are in the field. Okay, next slide, please. So there are some knuckleheads in the world who go around trying to do gotcha. And they say very aggressive, hostile things repeatedly. So they say things like, well, with such a small sample, how do you know that your results are representative? And so when you're young, this can be extremely stressful. And so you just need a canned answer where you calmly say, my study seeks to understand the meaning of events. I'm not trying to generalize in a statistical way. I'm trying to improve our mechanisms, our understanding of key social processes. And I'm unpacking the factors that matter. Sometimes these processes are missed by other studies. So people are going to say these challenging questions. Doesn't it change to have you be there? Don't your results vary a lot by when you go and who you interview? Aren't the results unreliable? Can your results be replicated? So these are sort of what I call quantitative methods, statistical approaches to qualitative data. And here you're trying to politely and calmly not be rattled by this, not be anxious about it, but just say a standard answer, which more or less you say to everybody. And so in the book, these are examples of what I think you could say. You'll find your own that makes sense to you. But this is not a resolvable problem. And may 1,000 flowers bloom. Hopefully we have other studies and often they show a similar pattern. Next slide, please. So to get high quality data in interviews, you want to go deep in the interview. And depth is critical. This means you want to cover a limited number of topics and then try to understand what it means to them. And that means often you're going to probe 2 or 3 times. Let me get a glass of water. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So you want to stay with a question. In the interview, the first 15 minutes are key. Here, what you're doing is you're training the respondent. You're helping the respondent think, okay, this is a partnership. They're there to help you. They're going to help you answer questions. How often in life does somebody listens to you mesmerized without any criticism for an hour? And often people find the process of being interviewed interesting. They reflect on their lives in new ways. But what you're doing is you're trying to probe. You want to, by probe, I mean you want to go deeper and get more detail. Who, what, when, where, how. You want to show you're listening, and you want to use the respondent's word as a probe. Next slide, please. So here are useful probes. Sometimes you can use the same one over and over. Can you tell me more about that? Or just taking the last words of their sentence and repeating it? Silence is an excellent probe. Can you think of a recent example of that? What was that like for you? And then sometimes some people say, I talked to you, tell me this. Other people say that. What's it like for you? Like opposites. Some people find corporal punishment helpful. Other people don't. What's it like for you? So these are standard probes to go deeper. So I want to tell you an example of an interview that was done by a very capable first-year doctoral student. She was very smart, very conscientious. She was interviewing a white working class mom who had 3 kids. She had met her briefly in the football field, and she was talking to her about her kids' organized activities. This is for unequal childhoods. But I thought her probes were not ideal. I'm going to try to show you why. Okay, next slide. So Mrs. Silverman says, Jim, he's 21, Trishy's 14, Dougie, he's 9. Now the interviewer says, now if you were just describing Doug to someone who'd never met him before, what would you say to give a picture of him? So notice that a slight rift has opened up because Mrs. Silverman is calling him Dougie, but the interviewer is using the word Doug. But I think it would be better to say Dougie because that's what the mom has said, to say you're listening, you hear her, and you want to use the term. Okay, next slide, please. Mrs. Silverman says, this is a very typical answer, which says about 5 things. He's a good kid some days, and some days he's a bad kid. He's smart. To me, he's very smart. Sometimes I have problems with his behavior. He's good. So note the mom has said, first, he's a good kid. Some days he's a bad kid. Some days he's smart, sometimes, but he's good. That's 5 different points. So immediately, as an interviewer, you have to decide what direction you're going to probe on. Because rather than accepting this interview answer, you want to ask her to elaborate in some interesting and helpful way. Next slide. So here, the interviewer, I think was unfortunate, said, can you talk about that problems with his behavior? Now notice that the mom has praised her son 4 times. He's a good kid. He's smart. To me, he's very smart. He's good. The interview is a collaboration, and you're trying to build trust. And by saying problems with his behavior, I worry that she might have been insulted. She might have felt hurt. She might have thought that the interviewer was out to get her. So I might have try to ask a more neutral question, like, in the last few days when he was a good kid, did something happen? So that you would have a probe that draws on what she said, he's a good kid, but then has asked the person to elaborate that in more detail. Next slide. So you want to show the respondent you're listening. You want to use the respondent's words. You want to slow the interview down in the first 15 minutes. You're trying to be positive. You're trying to build trust. You're trying to look interested. You're trying to talk as little as possible. This is extremely complicated because here, like Ms. Silverman gave you 5 different directions, and you're trying to figure out which one should I do. You're looking at the clock. You don't have a lot of time, but it's imperative that you look interested and you stay focused on the respondent, even though you have a lot going on. You want to show you're listening. So now I want to talk briefly about field notes. Field notes are when after you visit the observational site, you write notes because you're not going to remember it later, and the first 24 hours are key. In the journalism, they have in a journalistic story, you're supposed to do who, what, when, where, how. I use an acronym RIGHT. First, who, what, when, where, how. Second, reaction, responses to the action in question, and then the response to the response. Let's say you look at a mom trying to help her kid with homework. You look what the mom says, and then you look what the kid does. You look at inaction, when there's silence or a nonverbal response. You look at timing, how slowly or quickly, and you look at emotions. So these are some things to guide your field notes. So now I'm going to give you an example. Okay, next slide, please. So you want to record the steps in a social interaction. You're trying not to skip a step. So if you have somebody walking across the room and then they're on a conference call, they have to sit down, they have to get on Zoom. You can use dialogue, but dialogue is very powerful. And you can evoke a setting, ideally with smells, lights, noise, colors, textures. Novelists do this very well. Often to be a good writer, you want to be a good reader. You want to keep reading novels. And you don't really need to record every detail. You want to prioritize observations that address your conceptual interest. Next slide. So here are some superb field notes I want to tell you about. They were done by a doctoral student. I was on a visit to a white middle-class family, and Melanie Hanlon. Melanie had a learning challenge and school wasn't that easy for her. Her dad had a master's degree, and the mom only had a community college degree. And they had homework battles day in and day out that were extremely painful. But this interviewer was superb, this field worker was superb at figuring it out. So next slide here. So Mrs. H, these are her notes verbatim, sits down next to Melanie, and Harry goes in the living room. That's her brother. She asks Melanie how it's coming along, then quickly says, notice she has an adverb in there. She doesn't just say, she quickly says, oh, Melanie, look, you're doing the same thing. Now you know that's not going to work. Go through it again. What's X times S? Then she shows non-verbally what's happening. Miss H was grasping, excellent word, a pencil. And when Melanie began, she began to impatiently and forcefully tap the point in the composition books. This is excellent because you can visualize it impatiently and forcefully. When Melanie incorrectly wrote down something, Miss H would tap heavily and say, do it again, now check your words. She might have said angrily says, or with a deep sigh, or frustrated. Melanie finished the question and triumphantly said, I got it right. Excellent word, triumphantly. Ms. H said, good, now do 2 more. Melanie mumbled something, but I can't do them by yourself. So what makes this field notes section excellent is that it's very vivid. You can see how people are acting and how they're talking. You can imagine it, you can visualize it. And it's a superb example of field notes. Okay, next one, please. It captures the frustration. It captures verbal detail. It captures nonverbal detail impatiently and forcefully, and it captures emotion. So this is writing something like that can take time. So you're trying to figure out what's valuable here. And you might look at your favorite books and books you admire and see how they do field notes. Okay, next slide, please. So field notes are just a pain in the neck to write. They need to be written within 24 hours, the lifeblood of the project. It's a very bad idea to go into the field without your field notes done from your last visit. I strongly discourage it. Years later, you depend on them, and it's valuable to capture social interaction, which is not found in interviews. And so field notes are just a wonderful gift that researchers are giving to themselves by doing them. But they're hard to do because you can't talk, you can't watch TV, you really have to just buckle down and do them. For Unequal Childhoods, it took 5 to 8 hours to write field notes after every 2 to 3 hour visit. So it takes time, so you have to make sure you have the time to write your field notes when you're doing your schedule. Okay, next slide, please. So now I want a little talk about, so you're doing these interviews, you're collecting this field notes, but you really are trying to find a focus. And this process, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, occurs throughout the entire process. And by iterative, it means it's repeated, it's over and over again. And here it's profoundly social. I'm a sociologist, it's social. Usually advances come not by yourself, but by talking to others, by reading other articles, by writing yourself a memo, by thinking about what are you learning. So then after a few interviews or a few weeks of data collections, you need to stop, take stock, make some decisions. And at this point, it's fine if you need to make changes. Sometimes at that point, you have to make a change in the design because of what you've learned. That's perfectly okay, in my opinion. I think it's okay for it to be emergent. I think by the time, at some point, you'll figure it out. And you need to figure it out by the time you're half to 2/3 of the way through. But you certainly do not have to have it figured out in the first 10 or 20 or 30% of data collection. It's appropriate to be confused. Next slide, please. So one way to think about this is that there's a research focus, which is a subject. It's an area of investigation. I'm studying women in prison. I'm studying the homeless. I'm studying children's activities or race or workplaces. That's not a question. A question has an answer. There are competing answers to a research question. A question is where you don't know the answer. How does class background shape kids' adjustment, college students' adjustment to college, for example? A lot of people look at achievement, but maybe has an impact on people's friendship processes. In other words, you're trying to go from a journey from a subject to a question. Next one, please. So overall, I think a theoretical, I'm a big fan of the work of Pierre Bourdieu, which I found extremely helpful. And these concepts can be a guiding light for you. They can help you narrow data collection. You can focus on the limitations of the literature, the data you have, and the concepts you personally find to be exciting and interesting. So you're trying to answer the question, so what? Unequal childhoods had very little to say about gender, but A, I wasn't that interested in gender. B, a lot of what I found was same old, so I wasn't going to focus on that. But other people with the same data set might have focused on that, fine. So it has to be something you're interested in and where you're trying to make a contribution. Next slide, please. So here are lots of ways to think about writing all the possible research questions and then using color coders, using red for one, or mobility, green for whatever, social capital, and then try to sort them out. You can talk to a friend, you can write in a journal, you can read an article, You can do anything that's helped you in the past, but it's imperative, it's very important to think as you go and to let go of some of the questions. So you don't want to have 10 questions. You want to have 1 or 2 questions, and you want to narrow as you go down. Thank you. Next slide. So one example of this is this fellow who's I call Rob Lyons, to give you an example. And he was taking a class with me. And he was interested in dogs. And so he and his fiance were fostering a dog, meant they had a dog living with them temporarily. And he started to do some interviews and he did some observations in the dog park. And immediately multiple questions arose. One was that he discovered that with unequal childhoods, I show class differences in childbearing. And it looks like this also happens with dogs. The middle class people reason with their dogs. They go, okay, Fido, would you like to go outside now? Pause. While working class people give directives. Don't do that, cut it out, you know. So it turns out that he found some married partners and they were from different class backgrounds and they were arguing over how to take care of the pet. So that was one possible question, which was really about marriage. Another one was that he noticed that he'd been living in this neighborhood for a while that was racially diverse, but then he noticed that people started yelling at him saying, take that, white boy, which had not happened. So about racial tension and was another possible question. And then he was also working in a homeless shelter for little kids, for women and children. And there's all this idea about pets needing fresh air. And so the pet dogs had rights and privileges that they had to go out every day for air. But these kids were in these very small spaces with their moms, and there was no notion that they needed fresh air or exercise. So he was interested in citizenship and rights. And then he was also interested in how to define a family, if the pets were part of the family or not. So notice these are 4 different questions. They're 4 different literatures. There's no one right way, but he needs to focus because he can't do all 4 in one study. So this is what I mean. Each of us needs to think of all the possible questions that are coming up and then choose one. And in his case, he chose the citizenship one and he let go of the other ones, which is hard. It's painful to do, but it's important. Next slide, please. So you want to, this is a little bit like Goldilocks. You don't want to narrow too soon. You don't want to narrow too late. You want to talk to others. You want to build in giving yourself papers, half-baked ideas. Often you'll get very negative feedback at first. I got very negative feedback about unequal childhoods at first. Very negative. But it took a while and then I stopped getting that feedback. So it's important not to be too discouraged and think criticism is part of the process, but it will get better as you adjust. Next one, please. So there's a long chapter about data analysis in the book. There are a lot of interesting works about data analysis. I mean, basically, I personally don't really like all these programs, which are basically elaborated filing cabinets. They don't really think for you. I mean, basically, you're the one doing the concepts, the codes. If you collected all the data and you know your data well, sometimes just using an Excel file is fine with a table and the key concepts on the row and then the examples in the column from what people said about something, just a little quote. So you're looking for just confirming evidence. You're looking to see maybe people didn't agree with a pattern. Maybe you're remembering the most articulate people. So you want to go through the data to make sure that your claims are actually well supported by your data, and you want to look at the deviant cases closely. So that's the purpose of data analysis, and there are many different ways to do it well. Next slide, please. So everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Most, thank goodness, are not consequential. We make them. People get mad at you. You apologize. You move on. So it's okay. It's going to happen. Next slide. And so summing up, I think there are huge advantages to having a small study with rich, detailed data from interviews with a lot of probing on your issues and field notes that are rich. You want to make a contribution, not just an empirical contribution by studying a group that hasn't been studied, but a theoretical contribution, improving our knowledge of the mechanism of how power works, how inequality works, how gender works, how racialization works. You're trying to improve our theoretical models. And I believe there are some fantastic studies being done that I look forward to reading. Next slide. And the best work is really done by young people. And young people, I have a piece called The Gift of Obscurity that's on my webpage. And there are hard things about being young. Nobody knows who you are. No one's reading your work. But in fact, a lot of fantastic work is done by young people and who are not really knowing what they're doing, but they're doing very interesting and innovative work. And we look forward to reading all of your work in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annette. I see clapping, like emoji clapping, physical clapping. So everyone's really excited. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm personally amazed at how many topics you've been able to cover in a few minutes, which usually take an instructor a whole semester. And I also want to thank you for your honesty, talking about anxiety, making mistakes, and that kind of stuff. So thank you so much. Your presentation is very, very valuable for us. We've read your work in our qualitative methods classes. So I'm sure all the students here are very excited to, for the opportunity of asking you a question. I see at least one raised hand. So two, I guess. Three. Okay, so let's take those three questions and then we'll do a round of answers. Would that work for you, Annette, taking three
Yes,
questions?
sure. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So let's go with Julia, Andrés, Ana, and Francisca. Pueden hacer las preguntas en inglés o en español, como prefieran, y si son en español, las traducimos. Entonces, Julia.
Hi, Professor Laurel. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very insightful. I originally read your book, Unequal Childhood Education class, where we also read Seamus Khan's Privilege. Your research connects education and wealth, something I find relevant to the institution holding this colloquium. And I am wondering what thoughts are on the importance of researching the elites and the particular challenges that emerge in terms of access, gaining and maintaining it through publication, considering like this opacity surrounding them, and especially institutions, educational institutions with a lot of privilege around them. Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and answer that one first. Yeah. So I've now interviewed 110 families who were wealthy, which I'm like very excited about. It was a lot of rejection. It was in fact my hardest study. The way it worked is I asked everybody I knew if they knew somebody who was wealthy, except for I didn't ask my students and I didn't ask my in-laws. And I said, oh, next time you see them, could you say, this gal who's doing a study, and would you have a phone call with her for 10 or 15 minutes, just to learn more about it? By agreeing to talk to her, you're not agreeing to be in the study, but to learn more about it. And it looks like when my acquaintance asked somebody, it looks like 20% agreed. So I mean, 8 in 10 did not agree, but 2 out of 10 did agree. And that is actually quite consistent with the research for the Survey for Consumer Finance, which is our best quantitative study in the US. And so I just did this inch by inch. But also there are a lot of people who work for the elite. I met a guy on a plane who was a chef who explained that they had a real menu and then they had a secret menu because rich people were always wanting to come in and they always wanted to have something off the menu. So they had a secret menu. So another possibility is also interview people who work for the rich, which is another possibility. But I think I was intimidated at first when I started doing this because I didn't really know very many. I came from a middle-class family. I didn't know that many wealthy people, but we have plenty of studies of the poor. So I think it is risky, but I think it's worth pursuing to do more studies of the wealthy.
Amazing. Thank you, Annette. Let's go with Andres and Francisca. And something I missed is please introduce yourself before asking the question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Francisca. I'm from Chile. I'm a doctoral student. And now I'm researching the ways in which life is valued through the interactions that take place in an emergency waiting room of a public hospital in Chile. So I am very interested in your whole presentation. So thank you very much because it was very stimulating. But I was very interested in the part that you talk about the field notes, because now I'm writing that and was very clear for me the note that you showed. And I want to ask about how you recommend presenting the findings of the field notes when you have this narrative dimension or narrative gender or yes, with the academic register or gender, to writing. How can you incorporate that kind of scenarios, to evoke scenarios, interactions, in a narrative way, but in a vivid way, but to inscribe that in the academic writing structure? So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think that field notes are lively and interesting. They enliven the prose for readers, but what you as the author, you're driving the narrative, not the field notes. So it's important that you state the idea beforehand, then you state the example, and then you draw a conclusion from the example. So if I was writing around that field note that you read, I would say, parents often exhibited significant frustration and anger in the homework battles. Then I would have and then I'd say, you can see by tapping the pencil and her impatience, Mrs. Handlin was frustrated. So I think often I try to take one piece of a field note so it makes one point, and then break it down so you have idea, example, interpretation, and then ideally the analysis will tie back to the overall thesis, say family school conflict over homework, or family school conflict generated by the school. So you're trying to show the overall contribution of each quote. When I'm presenting verbally on a PowerPoint, I do not put the whole quote up because everybody can read it. Unless they're people in a different language, usually they can read it very quickly before you can speak it. So to increase a sense of interest, I just put one sentence. I put the idea, the concept, then I put one sentence, and I read a longer quote, but I just have one or two sentences. And then I say about the person, their age, their gender, their race, their wealth, or whatever. So I put identifying characteristics of the speaker, but I don't say those in a presentation. I figure that people can just read them. And so I try to have some, if I have a 20-page article, I try to make sure I have at least 20 quotes in my presentation, in my paper, so that you have some richness. And often I try to give multiple quotes and then a little bit of disconfirming evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for all those tips, Annette. So there's a lot of hands up. Let's go with Andres, Christian, Maria Jose, and Camilo. So Andres.
Thank you very much, Professor Laro, for the talk. It has been amazing for me learning from you. And well, I'm a recent graduate of the master's degree in sociology at Los Andes, and I'm currently working as qualitative researcher in a research project about exclusion errors of cash transfers programs here in Colombia. So I'm preparing everything for field work, and this talk was like perfect for me because it's going to be very helpful, everything we heard today from you. But the question I wanted to ask was more related with the introduction of your book, Listening to People, that we also read in preparation for this colloquium. And by the end of the introduction of the book, you talk about the importance of keeping some balance between the rigorous and systematic approach to qualitative research with some sensitivity and like openness while doing fieldwork. And I wanted to ask you if you could share with us some strategies for keeping that balance between rigorosity but sensitivity at the same time. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it depends on what you really care about. Like, in other words, my whole career has been about class. I really care about class. So that means I'm going to be very concerned that I have a very clear definition of the social classes. I'm going to keep some people in and some people out based on that definition. I'm also going to be very clear about racial distribution. Like, I've interviewed a few people. Like, I added people from who were born in India who were US citizens to my sample, in my wealthy sample. But some people are immigrants and some people aren't. I'm not systematically comparing that in my study. So some people are single parents, some people aren't. I'm letting go on that. So you have to think, what are the three most essential aspects of this study? And be incredibly systematic about that. And then for the most part, let the rest go. But I would run it by other people and see what they think about this design. And because I think feedback is helpful. But one study is not perfect. And we can't make our studies perfect. So we have to have some heterogeneity within the categories.
That's so true, and it's sometimes even a harder decision what to leave out than what to pay attention to, right? Okay, let's go with Christian.
Thank you very much, Professor. What a privilege. I would like to ask, well, my first question was related with the latter question, but I would like to know your opinion about qualitative software tools for qualitative analysis, and also in your perspectives, which are the main risks and benefits of using said tools. Thank you so much.
I'm pretty skeptical about the value of these qualitative data analysis. I think there's no substitute for reading the interviews closely, looking for themes, and looking for disconfirming evidence. I mean, these studies, these tools were developed for people who didn't collect their own data, who have 500 people in a sample. That's why they were invented, right? So they're expensive, they take time to code everything. They have to be valuable for you. I use Atlas now, I've used NVivo before. I mean, I don't think there are important differences among them. I do, because this study, Deduce is another one. There are plenty of them. Some of them are only online, and I have extremely confidential data. So for Atlas, I couldn't do Deduce because I was afraid it was online and I was worried about confidentiality. In Seamus's Kahn book, Sexual Citizens, he did not use software. And some people are not using software. It's an unusual choice, But you could have to say, I looked for disconfirming evidence, I created data matrices. I was systematic about the data. But I think if it's helpful for you, then sure, I would use it. But I would not add work if it's not helpful for you. Because you've collected if you've collected all your data, if you haven't, and one thing it's good for is you can say, oh, how many quotes do we have on this issue, or 5 years later, if you've forgotten it, you can just generate it quite quickly, and that can be very helpful. So I think it depends on how much of the data you collect and how big your study is, whether or not it's valuable to use the software systems. But I would not, it's not thinking. And anyone who thinks it's thinking is crazy. And so you have to really keep it in its place. It's like an elaborate set of file folders. That's what it is. It's no more than that. But sometimes it's handy to go through and say, okay, here's the file folder on this point, and pull it out. That's what it's doing for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that definition of an elaborate set of file folders. And then let's go with Maria Jose's question.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was extremely useful. I'm currently doing my master in sociology, and I'm doing my thesis about how social networks can affect the life trajectory of homeless people here in Bogota. So I had this question, especially regarding the introduction of your book, that you mentioned that many qualitative studies fall short despite well-designed projects and having extensive data collection. So I would like to answer, what do you consider are the most common pitfalls in qualitative research, and what can people do and researchers do to avoid these mistakes?
I think the most common pitfall is not focusing early enough and just collecting data and saying you'll figure it out at the end, which I myself am guilty of sometimes. Because it's very painful to sit down and figure it out. And also not having enough depth. Like this is Voices in America project where they're trying to do a random sample of people and collect data. And David Grusky and other people are doing it. And I just don't feel that they have a lot of depth on the data. Like if you ask a question, you need a follow-up question. Often I'll ask 2 or 3 questions on one topic. So that's to me, you need to make hard choices. That means you can't ask a lot of questions if you're going to go that deep on that question. So a common pitfall is people ask too many questions and don't get enough depth on every question. I think that's a very common. And also I think a very common pitfall is that people are anxious about starting and they don't start on time. And they put it off. They keep putting it off. And they burn valuable time when they really need to be collecting data, but it's hard to begin. So sometimes having a buddy and say, okay, I promise you I'm going to start this day. And also not being overly ambitious. I mean, to do an interview is a lot. The most you can do, in my opinion, is 2 interviews per day. And, you know, right now in my life, if I do 4 interviews a week, I'm exhausted, you know. And interviews are tiring. And so it's common to be overly ambitious and then sometimes under ambitious.
Thank you, Mahon. Thank you, Annette. Camilo.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Camilo Lopez. I'm a doctoral student here at the Universidad de los Andes. Well, I'm very happy to have you here with us. It's very exciting to read you and now listening to you. I had a question that in the book you mentioned the writing groups and how it has helped you to try to get the focus that you need. And I would like you to talk with us a little bit more about these writing groups. I got the sense that you had one with some colleagues and another one with your students. But maybe how did they form and what happens in them? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. The one with my colleagues, I just created, I've been in a bunch of different ones because I had 4 different jobs. I moved institutions. Each place I've been, I've had a writing group. I just asked people who seemed nice, who gave valuable feedback, but were not too scathing in their comments. I needed people who were positive and constructive, and who were also writing. There's some people, you know, most unfortunately, who can never finish a project. They can't. They just can't. They're too perfectionist. They keep saying they're going to do it, but they don't do it. So if people can actually send something out the door, that's a good writing group partner. And so I said, well, why don't we just try this? Let's meet every 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll try it for a semester, and we'll see how it goes. And then, you know, if it doesn't work for us, fine. We'll just try it for a semester. The one I had with my students, I was the professor, and I had 3 to 5 students, and that met usually every 2 weeks, but sometimes every 3 weeks. And either one person would be up or 2 people would be up. And they would submit a piece in writing a week before. And it was confidential. They could only keep it in the writing group. They couldn't show it to anybody else. We couldn't send it to anybody else without permission. And everybody read it and provided marginal comments and summary comments. And so, in other words, if you had a paper you wanted to send to a journal, you would give it to a writing group first, and then writing group would give you feedback. But also, it's easier to see problems in other people's work than in your own. And so writing group, you actually, even though it's a time sink, you actually learn a lot by reading other people's work, and it helps you develop your work. Sometimes these writing groups can be prone to drama, not very often, but sometimes people can have a conflict. I knew one writing group that fell apart because of it. If it happens, it happens. Just start another one, you know. And so I think it's a great thing to do. And you don't need, because all the research shows social isolation is bad for people and social support is helpful. And we also do a check-in where we go around for 5 minutes. People would say, what's happening? I was in a dissertation support group when I was writing a dissertation that I read about in a finished dissertation. You know, when Christmas would come and we'd all go home and everyone say, you're still in graduate school, you haven't finished your dissertation yet. We sort of talked about how to handle this kind of stuff. Or if a parent was sick and we couldn't work. And so, and that group was from people from other departments, but it was an hour and a quarter a week. And each person went around the circle and said what was going on, how it was going, and what they needed to work on. You know, sometimes their advisor was ghosting them or whatever, and people had ideas about how to solve. So that wasn't a substantive group. That was just more of an emotional support group that was also very helpful. So I think these groups, you just try them out, but I think you just have to start them on your own with people who you like, or you seem like you'd like to get to know better, and then see how it goes. But they can be very helpful. My writing group with my 2 people, they very graciously read listening to people, you know, completely. And they read also at the same time I was writing this book with Blair Sackett called We Thought It Would Be Heaven. And they read that too, you know. And they provided invaluable feedback, which made it much better.
Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Annette. I love how through all these questions we're covering so many parts of the research process and the writing process and, you know, processing through emotions and everything. I just realized, I think at the beginning of the colloquium, I forgot to even say the title, but this might be a good time, which is Qualitative Methods, Predictable Challenges in Doing Qualitative Research and What to Do About Them. And yeah, I feel like through all these questions and of course your talk, Annette, we're covering so many of these predictable challenges. So I saw there was someone else raising with a hand raised. Let's go with Alejandro.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, Annette, for your talk. I'm a senior undergrad of political science here at Los Andes, and I am planning to research on the particularistic relationships that might evolve around oil extraction in some municipalities in the Colombian eastern region. And regarding the talk, I was asking to myself, how do you approach difficult questions and difficult themes with your like people in the study? I plan to ask about corruption, ask about companies' pressures under politicians. So, what are your tips towards addressing not certainly illegal topics, but rather difficult to them or socially sanctioned topics in the interviews and observations?
Somebody wrote, "Are you corrupt or not?" I think that is sensitive. Like I was interviewing these wealthy people, and not all of them were very philanthropic, which surprised me. So, like one person made $1 million a year, and she only gave away $500, and I couldn't figure out to ask her, did you think about it giving away more? But I didn't want to be critical of her, you know. So I think sensitive questions should come later in the interview. If you can do 2 interviews, that would be good. If you can kind of get to know them and have a beer. And if you could not record that piece of it, I don't know. I think it's tricky. But I think you want to be sensitive to the sensitive nature of it. I mean, you could say, do you have a friend, whoever, you know, sometimes people have a lot of pressure on them, and they sometimes they'll end up being asked to take money to do this or that. And though there's a wider range of this, do you have ever have a friend where that happened to them, or you ever saw that happening? And then tell them not to use the person's name, you know. Sometimes you can say, some people are religious and go to church all the time. Other people really never go to church. What's it like for you? You know, you could say, you know, domestic violence is very common and many people have experiences with it. What's been your experience? So you can try to take highly stigmatized topics. How many times have you been arrested? Not if you have been arrested, but just say, oh, how many times have you been arrested? You're trying to normalize these experiences to make it seem like they're normal. The people did it for good reasons. You may not like the reason, but it was a good reason. And you're trying to understand their experience with it. But I would tread very cautiously because it's a small community. And whatever you interview somebody, everyone else is going to know about it. And so I think if you could just do an interview that's a very basic interview at first, and then kind of get settled in, and then maybe I might circle back to the more sensitive aspects of your study, if that's possible.
Thank you both. Let's go with Majo, and then I might read 2 questions from the chat.
Good. Thank you, Annette. It's really a pleasure to be chatting with you and to see our students that read you in our classes engage with the bibliography, which is you in this case. It's very, very, I don't know, emotional to us. I wanted to ask you something about interpretation and how to not over-interpret interviews or the risks. And I'm going to put you an example of something we did with Andres, the student that just talked. And we found some differences between Argentina and Colombia in terms of redistribution. The Argentinians were more redistribution, whereas the Colombians were more pro-distribution, which doesn't make sense because Colombia is much more inegalitarian, Argentina is much more egalitarian. So we were wondering about the whys, and in wondering about the whys, the qualitative information we had was not enough. So sometimes you have to go outside of your interviews to find causality. And then the risk is to overinterpret or kind of psychologically interpret the intentions. So we started, to give you a concrete example, we started talking about the tiredness of redistribution that the Argentines had, and the desire of redistribution that the Colombians had. And I'm pretty sure that's what happens, but it's very difficult to prove it. And definitely you cannot prove it with the data that we had. We have to go to other data. So I guess you know what I mean. What's the risk in overinterpreting the material that you have?
It's a huge risk. I remember my very first paper I ever submitted, I got, I wasn't used to it. I got a revised resubmit, which was good, but one of them said I made sweeping generalizations based on thin and sketchy data, and so it stuck with me. I think what they suggest that I do is I can conclude what I conclude based on my data. I can then speculate why it might be. I can say, well, I think it might be because of this, but I don't have data to support it. And other people have made this claim in other research using this data, and I think that's plausible. But I think we have to be cautious about what we can claim we can claim what we know from our data, but then if we want to go beyond our data, we have to just help the reader understand that we're speculating at this point, and just clearly signaling the bright line where I'm changing into a new direction.
All right, thank you. So we have like 10 more minutes. I'm gonna read 2 questions from the chat. So one is about something you briefly mentioned in the talk, Annette. And this person is saying, when I use surveys or semi-structured interviews to investigate social phenomena, my professors always ask me about the statistical representativeness of the sample. They tell me that interviewing or surveying 10 people is not very representative. In that sense, I would like to know how to deal with the quantitative objection that qualitative data collection methods must meet some kind of criterion of statistical representativeness or something like that. So that's one question. And then the other question is by Angie Hernandez. And she said that she says that at the end of your talk, you mentioned that you've seen your students or other researchers generating innovative studies and methods. And Angie asks, could you share some innovative research approaches you've observed?
So I think that the best defense is a good offense for the people, and say, survey research is very valuable, but they're asking fixed response questions that may or may not be meaningful to people and may not capture the complexity of their daily life. Of course, I have a very small sample, but my questions allow us to think more deeply about the conceptual mechanisms that may be shaping social processes that may not surface and that may not be captured by quantitative methods. So you're criticizing them as missing like half the world, basically, because of the in the US, these surveys are very expensive to run. So it's very hard to add new questions. And there's a big pressure to keep the length of the survey down. So any survey researcher is going to say, yeah, the surveys are limited because we can only have one question on this. So you're saying I have a lot of depth about this, and my qualitative interviews allow me to unpack mechanisms. I think it's also helpful to be systematic there. I think it's better to say, I don't have people in 5 social classes and 3 genders. I think if you have 10 people, it would be better to say have 1 class and 1 race and 1 gender. So you can say, look, and I'm looking at upper middle, college students of this race to understand this question, because I'm trying to understand, and I also try to unpack a conceptual process. I think, and I was just in England for 6 months, and the US has a big thing about having larger samples. So it's harder to get in the journals with fewer than 30 respondents, often 30. Some of them have 50, but it's unusual to see a paper published with 10 people in sociology. But in the US, in Europe, they're more flexible. And the samples are smaller. For innovative studies, I thought Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, was an excellent book. And it was quite innovative, and partly people tend to, like, we don't have very many studies of eviction, but eviction is a very important process. And there are a lot of important aspects of daily life that we don't have studies of because it's not come up. Fred Weary is doing a lot at Princeton. He's doing a lot of interesting work on credit and borrowing and giving money and managing requests for money. Mario Small is looking at banks, and he looked at pawnbrokers. And even Black middle-class people tend not to use banks, use banks in lower numbers than white middle-class people. And he did a survey about where people had banks. And then, so I think Mario Small, who's now at Columbia, has done some very innovative work. So I think Jessica Coloquio was interesting. She had a paper who wrote Negotiating Opportunities, and I was her doctoral advisor. And, she had this paper that ultimately was published in American Sociological Review. And she had some quantitative reviewer who wanted her to count things, or maybe I suggested, anyway, at some point I told her to count things. And she just counted on one day. But she counted after she'd done all this ethnography. But then she did count on one day how many times kid asked questions. And that table is in there, and it's pretty helpful. Like when I teach it, and the students like it. So sometimes it can be helpful to count some things, surprisingly. How often kids ask a question in a certain amount of time, based on the research you're doing. Yeah. So I think the fact that I think we have a lot of important research on important topics, but just because somebody's not done something doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because sometimes it can be valuable. I would ask around, I would talk to professors and go and see if they raised important questions about it before I would start it. But then I think it could be interesting.
All right, thank you so much. I think we can finish on that note of, encouraging people in this room to try out new methods and, embrace the emergent aspect, not only of data, but also of adjusting methodologically to the questions you want to ask and to, the ways to gather that data. So thank you so much, Annette. You've been incredibly generous with your time, with your answers. Thank you so much to everyone who joined today for your questions. Our next colloquium is on September 25th. It's also online, and we'll have Santiago Vargas, a doctoral student in sociology from University of Cambridge. And, I'll keep you posted about our schedule for the rest of the semester. Thank you everyone so much. And thank you, Annette, again.
Sure, thank you. Good luck to all of you with your projects. They sound very interesting. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, Annette.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.